On the night of April 14th, 1912, a lookout named Frederick Fleet spotted something in the dark. By the time the wheel turned, it was already too late. But what if it hadn't been? What if the iceberg had passed 30 seconds later, or the ship had turned 30 seconds sooner? The real answer to what would have happened next is stranger, and in some ways, sadder than you'd expect. Start with the obvious question. Could the Titanic have actually missed it? Maritime historian Tim Maltin has spent years studying the exact conditions of that night, and his research points to something unusual. The North Atlantic that evening sat under a rare atmospheric condition called a thermal inversion, layers of cold and warm air that can bend light and create a false horizon. It likely made the iceberg harder to see and the horizon itself deceptive. A slightly earlier warning, a slightly different angle, and the lookout might have caught it in time. It wasn't inevitable, it was close. So say it happened. Say the ship missed the berg entirely and sailed on toward New York. The most immediate effect wouldn't have been cultural. It would have been financial. The Titanic was the flagship of the White Star Line, and its owner, J. Bruce Ismay, was already competing hard against rival Cunard line ships. A successful maiden voyage would have cemented White Star's reputation for luxury over speed, likely accelerating an ocean liner arms race that was already underway. Bigger ships, more opulent interiors, more first-class competition between shipping lines chasing the wealthiest transatlantic travelers. Here's where it gets more complicated. The disaster didn't just end lives. It rewrote maritime law. The sinking directly led to the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea in 1914, a treaty that mandated enough lifeboats for every passenger, 24-hour radio watches, and iceberg patrols in the North Atlantic that still operate today. Without the disaster forcing the issue, these reforms likely still would have come, but slower, and probably only after some other disaster forced the same reckoning. Regulation, historically, tends to follow tragedy rather than anticipate it. Then there's the harder question. What about the people? More than 1,500 people died that night, and the ripple effects of those individual absences are almost impossible to calculate honestly. Some were prominent industrialists, and their decisions would have shaped businesses for decades. Most were ordinary passengers and crew whose survival would have meant ordinary things. Children who grow up, marriages that happen, grandchildren who exist in a version of history where they otherwise wouldn't. That's not a footnote. That's the actual weight of the question, underneath all the trivia about lifeboats and speed records. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who located the wreck in 1985, has spoken about how finding the ship transformed it from a myth into a fixed physical place, 12,000 feet down, still slowly dissolving into the seafloor. If the Titanic had survived that night, there would be no wreck to visit, no memorial written in rusted steel. There would just be old photographs of an aging ocean liner, eventually decommissioned like dozens of others. Its most famous night simply never happening, which raises the strange part. The Titanic is remembered today almost entirely because it sank. If it had completed its voyage safely, it likely would have been a successful, well-regarded ship, and then, over time, a forgotten one. Overshadowed by faster liners, retired quietly in the 1930s, scrapped for metal, remembered mostly by maritime historians and nobody else. Sometimes the thing that makes an event unforgettable is the same thing that makes it a tragedy. The ship that succeeded would have vanished from memory. The ship that failed became permanent. On the night of April 14th, 1912, a lookout spotted something in the dark. And whether or not the wheel turned in time, something about that night was always going to be remembered. It just depends on which version of remembered you're talking about.